It's almost about that time. Right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Todd Boyd, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure to have you. What a great book, Rappers Deluxe. Love the title. Where did you come up with that title? Obviously a play on Rapper's Delight, but tell me a little bit about the process of coming up with the title.
Well, I think, obviously, I'm sorry. Let's start that up. Let's do that again.
All right, we'll start right from the top.
I got, I'm too many things going on here, but
everybody's flashing.
Yeah.
That's all. Well, you know what? I'm going to ask you a different question anyway, and then we'll get into the title. So,
okay.
Todd Boyd, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Love your book. Have it on my coffee table now. It's like the kind of book it's like made for me. I could just dive into this book, any page, and sort of just explore what was happening during that time. It's great graphics, and obviously great wordsmithing. Let's talk first a little bit about who you are and what you're up to now. Like what is your job now?
What is my job now? My job now is promoting this book. That's my job now. That's what I've been doing for the last 2 months. I really don't like talking about myself, but I am.
We're going to talk a lot about you today, but we'll see. You can tell me what your comfort level is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professor at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, where I've been for a very long time. A lot of people know me from my numerous documentary appearances. And I'm author of this book, among so many other things.
Yep. Well, first of all, my son is applying to USC, so we hope that he'll see you on the campus there and say what's up. He's applying to the music school, the music production. All right. So let's talk about the origin of this book, though. How did you get the idea to create Rappers Deluxe?
Well, I was actually approached by the publisher, Phaidon, with an idea about, sort of a book about hip hop more broadly. And as we began to discuss it, I recognized that, this was a story that could only be told now. Like you needed, the long arc from the 70s to the present to be able to tell this story. And, breaking it down decade by decade, I think at some point I realized, not initially, but I realized that we were approaching what people were identifying as the 50th anniversary of hip hop. That wasn't my thought initially, but, in the process, sort of realized that was coming about in 2023. And so, 50 years is, of course, a long time. As I say, there are no 50-year trends or 50-year fads. If something's around for 50 years, that's very substantial. And so, the opportunity to tell this 50-year story and everything that had happened over that period of time, it's not the sort of thing you could tell in 10 years or 20 years. You needed the full arc. I mean, this is half a century. So it's a book that I think couldn't have been written 10 or 20 years ago. It could only be written now because you have the full sweep of history to observe. And so that's the story I'm trying to tell in the book, is how we get from this sort of legendary party in the early 1970s to Dre and Snoop and Kendrick Lamar and others performing at halftime of the Super Bowl.
It's incredible history. It makes me feel a bit old because I've been a fan since, I guess, 79 would be when I signed on. When I first heard Rappers Delight at a middle school dance, a completely transformative moment in my life.
Right.
Found the record, memorized the 15-minute version. But what's interesting is when you talk about hip hop and what's kind of revolutionary about your book is that I think a lot of people, when they think about hip hop, they think of the music, right? But that's just a component of hip hop, a very important component of hip hop, but it's not the whole story. So tell me, when you say hip hop, what do you mean?
Well, one of the distinctions I make early in the book is a distinction between, say, rap music and hip hop culture. It's often the case, as you point out, that if you mention hip hop, people just assume you're talking about the music. And the music's certainly part of it, and perhaps the uh, most significant part of it. But what I was interested in was telling a story about how, this evolved as a culture and how it affected other areas. So film and art, sports, fashion, politics, language. I was interested in how this, genre of music, as it were, was able to impact all these other areas and create what I consider to be a cultural movement. Hip hop has always been more than the music, even though that's the place where a lot of people identify it. So when you think about culture and a cultural movement, I mean, hip hop has really kind of seeped into the veins of America, if you will. And so, there's so many instances I, notice, for instance, every day, people using language that comes from hip hop culture. And I mean, everybody, I mean, across the board, and they don't even realize where it came from.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that's but one example, but there are multiple examples. So my idea was to use the music as a frame, and then from there, go out and look at all the other areas where that music has come to influence society and culture, and then overall um, think about it as a prominent cultural movement.
Talk a little bit about, I know you say you don't like to talk about yourself, so this will be the portion of the interview we talk about yourself, and I promise we'll go back to talking about hip hop. But you say in the book that your coming of age coincided with hip hop's coming of age. I thought that was really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about, your coming of age, what was sort of happening in the culture at that time, and kind of, where you grew up, that kind of stuff, what you were listening to, what you were watching?
Well, the book begins in the 1970s, which of course is when we have this sort of origin story of DJ Kool Herc throwing this party in the Bronx in 1973. And this is a really interesting time in the 1970s overall. I mean, for much of the decade, hip hop would be something that was underground, that was only available to people, say, living in New York, who had access to that culture. It was not above ground. It was not prominent or popular in
No
any.
internet, no internet, and wasn't even on television, wasn't even on
I
the
mean,
radio.
yeah, not even radio, television. I mean, the internet's a long way off.
Yeah, but not even on
But
the radio, like you said. Yeah.
right. It's not something that's available to people outside of that experience. It's not yet music played on the radio. By the late 70s, you get, Rappers Delight, but we're talking several years before that. But of course, there's a lot of other culture during that time. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the book, which was real interesting to discover through the research process, was the same week that, Kool Herc, the same time period when Kool Herc threw that party, the number one film in the country was Pam Grier's film Coffee,
Hmm.
uh, a blaxploitation film that, of course, in the 90s, you would have the rapper Foxy Brown being another of Pam Grier's films from the 70s. And you'd also have Quentin Tarantino's film Jackie Brown. So you could see how something that happened in the 70s, sort of above ground, the number one film at the box office, the same week as, Kool Herc throwing this party. Well, only people in that environment know about Kool Herc throwing that party, but the top movie in the country is a blaxploitation movie, and blaxploitation would become integral to hip hop in its development and would have, manifest itself in future decades. So, I look at a lot of what's going on at that time in the 70s and how all these visible things that are taking place influence what's, in other words, underground or say invisible to the public. And so as hip hop develops, it's being influenced and inspired by blaxploitation films, people like Richard Pryor, Miles Davis, political movements, figures like the Black Panther Party. There's this interesting moment, when you start to have mayors of prominent population centers, large cities, Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, electing Black mayors. All of these things that had come up in the 1970s. And this is when I was growing up. And so, I was very much into the music I heard, R&B, soul music, fascinated with, sports, certainly Muhammad Ali. And, one of the things I also mentioned in the book is this is a moment when you have a lot of Black, veterans coming home from Vietnam. It's the end of the Vietnam War. And, a lot of them are wearing these military issue jackets, which I think of as in a lot of ways kind of the origin of street style, streetwear. So there's so many elements of like my childhood when I was absorbing all this culture, the visibility of a basketball player like Dr. J, for instance. I'm just paying attention to so many of these things as a kid. I've been telling people, I actually feel like I started writing this book when I was 9 years old because so many of the influences from that time of my life, manifest themselves in the larger culture. So, the book is a product of my own interest, my own development, culturally speaking, but also at some point in my life, I went to graduate school and got a PhD and became a professor and began to write and do research about, popular culture and particularly hip hop culture. And so it's personal, but it's also professional. And I sort of bring those two things together in terms of my overall approach to telling the story about the book over this 50-year period. It's my 50-year experience, but it's also, 50 years in terms of experience in the culture.
And I must mention that you have gone by the MC moniker Notorious PhD, that you wrote that in your book.
The LA Times wrote a feature on me some, 20, 21 years ago now. And they titled it Notorious PhD. And I thought the title fit, so, I ran with it. But
yeah, you might as well go with it.
When I was coming up, you couldn't give yourself a nickname. So I have to clarify for people. I don't call myself that. That's what I was called.
Okay.
Kind of bestowed upon me, but it fit. So, Notorious PhD has become a thing.
Talk to me about the first time you heard a rap. You grew up in Detroit, correct?
Yes.
So, a lot of, I had the good fortune just of actually growing up right outside New York City. And of course, I thought this was happening around the world. Like I had no idea that this was just like a New York thing, right? But growing up in Detroit, you're a little removed from it. Like we said, there was no, radio wasn't playing hip hop unless you like went to a party that was playing you wouldn't even know hip hop existed or rap music in this case existed. So what was your first exposure to a rap?
Well, I think the thing about New York in the 70s is it was an experience.
Mm-hmm.
And even people living in New York, not all of them were familiar with what was going on in hip hop. It was a underground movement. Sure. And so anybody outside of that, you really had no access to it. But, like anything, once it's played on the radio, wherever you are, you can hear the radio, you can hear the song. And that song turns out to be, Rappers Delight. And so I heard Rappers Delight. I remember, some people trying to describe it to me and they were sort of unable to. Their mind was blown and they didn't know how to properly describe it. Well, it's not singing and it's kind of funny. And so when I finally heard it on the radio, I knew, oh, this was the song they were trying to describe. And it was Rapper's Delight. And, I had been familiar with people rhyming. Muhammad Ali had rhymes. The comedian Nipsey Russell, who becomes the namesake for Nipsey Hussle, Nipsey Russell would appear on these game shows in the 70s. He had rhymes. Right. You might encounter somebody in the street, who had rhymes. Rhymes were common, but the idea that you would, put this on a record again. I mean, I heard, guys I knew reciting Dolomite. For instance, a sort of figure who Eddie Murphy played a few years ago in the film. But Dolomite was something people would quote. Dolomite had a lot of rhymes. So rhyming itself was not foreign. But the idea that you could make a whole record and there's no one singing, this is the heyday of R&B and soul music. And you're using music that, someone had already created. I mean, I like Chic and I like Good Times on its own, before somebody flipped it in a rap song. So, to hear somebody rhyming and, to do it for a whole song. And you mentioned this, but there's the radio edit, and then a lot of times they would play the long version, which is 7 or 8 minutes long.
Yep. And
there's that additional segment. When you get to the end of it, have you ever gone over a friend's house
to eat?
You say no good.
A lot of people hate that part. I like that part. A lot of people hate that part of that rap.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't part of the sort of radio edit, but I enjoyed when they would play that, because it was just more of it. I enjoyed it. Yeah. I enjoyed it so much that I wanted more. So that was fine with me. But hearing it on the radio, and then, after that, I remember Curtis Blow, Christmas rapping,
Breaks,
group called Sequence. Sugar Hill Gang doing Apache, and then subsequently, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, which of course is really Melly Mel and Duke Booty doing The Message, Africa Bambaataa. Even somebody like Gil Scott-Heron, who's not rapping, but whose sort of spoken word approach to the music was very much, sort of influential on what rappers would ultimately come to do. So I've been around since the beginning of that music when it was on the radio and you could hear it. And I remember there was not a lot to listen to for a while. And that would change. But, those early days, like when Big says, remember Rappin' Duke, like I do remember Rappin' Duke.
So do I. I was so happy when you brought that up in the book because I was like, I actually owned that 12-inch. For those who, probably the 5 people in the audience who might know what we're talking about because it's such an obscure record. This was like somebody doing John Wayne's voice. Aha, baha, da, ha, 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 ha. Yeah. Sure. Terrible rap. And I want to get into like when rap got corny like that. But I want to linger for a minute on Rappers Delight since it was so formative for both of us. Some people might not really know the story of how that came about. I know it's been told a lot of times, but would you mind just like giving us because in some ways it's an interesting story in what it says about hip hop in general, because it was like almost like they were the Sugar Hill Gang who did the Rappers Delight were almost like the original boy band in a way. Like they weren't a group that was out there doing their thing. And there were groups at that time that were like showing up at parties like the Cold Crush Crew, right? There was groups that were rapping, but they weren't one of them. They were put together by, and I'll let you continue the story from here, but they were put together by Sylvia Robinson. And who was she? And can you tell me a little bit about the story about that?
Well, Sylvia Robinson had a career as a, singer, Mickey and Sylvia. Love is Strange. If people have seen Scorsese's film Casino, that song is very prominent. Mm-hmm. But also, I remember seeing Sylvia on Soul Train, performing under the name Sylvia, particularly around a hit called Pillow Talk. So somebody who had been in the industry for a long time, and she really wanted to kind of capture the feeling of, you know, hip hop party on a record, hip hop music. And her son, as the story goes, is in a pizza parlor, and he, here's these guys who work there kind of rapping along to a song and asked them if, they want to come and record, basically. And, one of the guys has Grandmaster Caz's rhyme book because he's supposedly his manager. So the rhymes, aren't even his.
That's Big Bang Hank. Yeah.
It's kind of funny story, I think, considering, how authenticity would be one of the prominent themes in hip hop. Ultimately, there was nothing authentic about this group of people.
Exactly.
But, they put the music on record. And when you put it on record, you allow the world to hear it. And I think that's key. I mean, we can celebrate the origins for sure. But, what happens if that music never gets out of New York, if people can't hear it on the radio? So by hearing it on the radio, I mean, Sugar Hill Gang was sort of a created entity. But in a lot of ways, if you think about how important sampling is in hip hop, I mean, you take someone else's music and you kind of reappropriate it for your own purposes. Sugar Hill Gang is that, in a group form, I guess. You're taking somebody else's music and sort of presenting it in this kind of remixed way. It's not, it's not the most glamorous story, but it's kind of fun.
But in some ways, like you said, it's the ultimate American story because it's kind of capitalism too. It's right. It's like
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sylvia wanted to cash in, but she wanted to also capture this phenomenon, and you needed that technology to record it, make it a record, make it available. You needed that in order for it to spread. So we can sort of quarrel with the authenticity of that moment and laugh about it, but at the same time, it gave people outside of that tight-knit circle an opportunity to experience it.
I want you to talk about the connection between rap and luxury and the sort of bragging about, especially early rap. There's a lot of bragging about all the stuff they have. I got 2 big cars, and bodyguards, that kind of thing. You make a big point about, why in hip hop culture that is so misunderstood, right? Because like a lot of people who are like, don't like rap or hip hop are like, it's all about like material things. It's all, it's all like, and of course, all this was fantasy anyway, because none of these guys, like you said, they worked in a pizza parlor. They didn't have 2 big cars and bodyguards. And so talk to me about that, because that will continue. Certainly in the early days of rap, that was a big part of it, is the bragging part of it. But what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think that part ended. That hadn't stopped.
That's true. Yeah.
But that's hip hop, one of the stories I tell early in the book is about this thing I call the Cadillac effect. And, there was a time when Cadillac, was, the preeminent sort of luxury car that one could own. And back in the, let's say 1930s, perhaps, before and subsequently thereafter, as the story goes, Cadillac didn't want to sell their cars to Black people because they thought that it would, take away from the prestige of the brand. And the head of service for Cadillac, was visiting service centers, and he noticed all these Black people bringing in their Cadillacs, and he wondered, how could this be, considering we don't officially sell cars to Black people. And he learned that people were paying middlemen to, purchase the cars for them, and sort of realized the fact that people were willing to pay extra to have this product. And eventually General Motors, bought Cadillac and kind of shifted that process and started selling cars to Black people. And it said that this had a huge impact. I think with that example, what I find is this sense of, America's history And in capitalist America, where everything's for sale, you're saying to someone, you can't buy this, even if you have the money for it. And so it becomes, in my mind, a form of protest, a form of resistance to say, I have the money for this. I'm going to figure out a way to get it, even if you don't want me to have it. There's something in that that I've always found to be interesting and compelling and indicative of a kind of resistance to the status quo, albeit, based on materialism. But it just speaks to so many other examples of Black people in America's history being presented with obstacles that they had to figure out ways around, and in the process, do something opposite of what the intent may have been from those in power. And so, to me, the idea of owning luxury products, be they cars, or various fashion brands, or whatever, increasingly, contemporary art, for instance. It's something that a lot of people dismiss as materialism, but I never saw it that way. I mean, embedded in that is somebody saying, you didn't want me to have this, and I have it. And I obtained it. And so, I think for somebody, excuse me, who maybe has access to everything, you have the choice of not being materialistic. But if those material things are denied to you, perhaps you want them more than somebody else because you don't have the same access. And so I've always thought of, bragging, as it were. I mean, that's just somebody telling you, like, look, I've succeeded. I'm successful. I made it. I'm not supposed to have this.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought of it in that light. I mean, I like material. I don't have a problem with, luxury fashion brands and, luxury. I don't have a problem with any of that. I've never had a problem with it. But people have, excuse me, often tried to criticize that. And by extension, as you point out, criticize hip hop for it. But I just see it completely different. And, I think that's a honestly weak excuse for somebody to say, I don't like the materialism because you live in America.
Right.
This is a material culture, and it's not just specific to hip hop.
And seen them complaining when Madonna was singing about being a material girl.
Well, they were singing the song at the top of their lungs, probably.
Exactly. All right. I want to talk about some of the art during this period too, because, I never, you talk about Basquiat. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I had never connected him so much to hip hop. Like I think when I think about hip hop art, I think often about Keith Haring, because that was kind of like, if you were growing up in New York in the 80s, that was like, there was the pop shop and there was that crack as whack wall that you would see when you're driving into the city. There was a lot of Keith Haring. Basquiat, I didn't connect so much to hip hop, but you say that you connect him to hip hop. So talk a little bit about that and why his art to you reflects hip hop.
Well, Basquiat began to get attention by doing graffiti on walls in places like Tribeca and Soho. He was not, one of the taggers,
right?
People might associate with the overall, sort of graffiti movement in places like the South Bronx and other spaces. But he, had these really kind of pithy sayings he would write. He wrote it under the name same old shit, and created this kind of, flurry of interest around his identity and what he was doing. And of course, he's in the center of where the sort of art universe is functioning at that time. People like Andy Warhol, for instance. And, he's himself, someone who's connected to the culture, doing album covers. You see some of the early images of Basquiat in a film like Downtown 81. He's in the Deborah Harry Blondie video,
right.
Where she shouts out his friend, Fab Five Freddy. And then when you look at his art, I mean, Basquiat's work in the early 80s, 81, 82, 83, a lot of people suggest is him at the height of his career, deals with, elements in his paintings that I think are kind of reflective of some of the same things going on in hip hop. So for instance, Basquiat is known for, amongst other things, including the image of a crown in his work. Most young kings get their heads cut off.
Mm.
Crown is ubiquitous in hip hop. He's
Biggie.
known for
Yeah.
crossing out various words so that you pay more attention to the word once it's been crossed out.
Mm.
I've often likened this to sampling. I actually did a lengthy video essay for the Broad Museum here in Los Angeles on Basquiat's work from 2 or 3 years ago that's available for people if they're interested going deeper into this. But now Basquiat has become such a part of hip hop culture. Jay-Z and others have talked about owning Basquiat's, mentioned Basquiat's in their rhymes. There's the commercial, Jay-Z and Beyonce for Tiffany's with a Basquiat painting, Jay-Z's Picasso Baby, but other artists as well. There was a time when rappers were rapping about buying sneakers and buying cars, and now people are rapping about buying art, and Basquiat is central to that. Basquiat died in the late 80s. He was actually supposed to go to a Run DMC concert that night. So
Wow.
I think in the reconsideration of Basquiat now, it's important to connect him to hip hop because his timing in the 80s is consistent with that evolution, and his work also lends itself to those connections.
Let's talk about fashion for a minute. In the early days, and then it always pivots with hip hop in such an interesting way. And sort of in the early days of hip hop, everybody was dressing. I don't even know how to explain it. Kind of more Soul Train style. I don't know. It was like lots of like glittery type of clothes, and kind of like you said, a lot of the black exploitation, I think, influenced a lot of the fashion of hip hop early on. And then there's a change, and I don't know when that change happens, and you can tell me as a historian of this, but it seems like Run DMC started wearing the clothes that actually people would wear, like on the street, and was more reflective of the way people actually dressed at the time. Is that accurate? I mean, they might not have been the first, but it seemed like they were early to that.
Well, DMC, becomes kind of the first superstar hip hop group,
Right.
and style is very much part of their overall persona. From the Goliath Ultra frames, to the Adidas shell toes, Calvin Klein, no friend of mine, don't want nobody's name on my behind, Lee on my legs,
Yeah.
my Adidas, the song they do, of course, Adidas with no shoestrings in them. Like, I mean, they were rapping about their style. And when you saw them, they stood out, for their music, but they also had a distinct style. And they rapped about their style, I mean, you pointed out in Rappers Delight, I got more clothes than Muhammad Ali and I rap so viciously. I mean, so this is the thing. You're gonna talk about what you have on. And it turns out that those things can be part of your identity and also influence style overall. Sneaker culture has, expanded. It has its roots in that moment. Certainly before. I talk about a lot of this in the book, the Gucci sneakers from the 1980s, Fila, and all this, ultimately leads to, say, Air Jordans. But, frames, Lou Wassermans, as I call them, those Goliath Ultras.
You said a lot of these styles actually came from the dope dealers, right? Like, because they were the people that had the money.
Yeah, hustlers and dope dealers and pimps, street cats. They had money and rappers wanted to imitate them. Dapper Dan It's a
Hmm.
prominent story in the book when Dapper Dan's boutique was, operating at full speed. Um, I mean, it was just really fashion. I think has always been part of the culture. If you go back to the sort of heyday of jazz, someone like Miles Davis, who I mentioned in the book, and his influence on style. But this was a new generation, a new era. And as DMC emerged, I think they had style as part of their profile. I mean, Slick Rick with my Bally's on, like, LL's rocking Jordans on his album cover. All of these things, I think, become part of how you identify various rappers, and by extension, how that fashion, plays in the culture. I remember being in Detroit, and filas were the thing, like, and people were getting robbed, for their filas.
Right.
I mean, Jordan were brand new, but fila, that was what you wanted. And if you had a fila, warm up suit, you were really doing something. Velour warm up suit. So later, Ghostface says velour down like the Sheik of Iran. Um, you know, and there was this shoe chain in Detroit called Sibley Shoe Stores, chain of shoe stores, and they stopped selling filas because the violence associated with it. And that made people want it more. You deny somebody from having something. Now they really want it. So all of those things, sneakers, frames, uh, troop jackets. I mean, fashion just was an integral part of the culture. Rappers would rap about it, but also as you see people, Eric B and Rakim on their album cover rocking a Dapper Dan creation. That was a part of it from that moment, and I think has been consistently going forward.
Exactly. You mentioned that hip hop took a little bit of a corny route. Like it went almost like the way disco did, where certainly in the musical side of things, it went into like it became sort of popular. And then, that you hear like the end of disco was sort of like when they did Disco Duck and all these kind of really, really cheesy songs that came out.
Disco Rilla.
Yeah, disco real right. And then rap, like sort of the equivalent would be like you said, the Rap and Duke, and maybe even the Pee Wee Herman. There was like a thing. I mean, I know that was a dance, but whatever. There was a lot of like, and it could have gone in that direction. Like it could have just become a fad, but it doesn't. It pivots, and that's kind of the beauty of hip hop culture is that it always seems to, just when it starts getting cheesy and maybe like too mainstream, it pivots and then becomes a totally something new. So early on, what would you say like was a really definitive moment in rap where it kind of went from being, what could have just been a fad of the early 80s to something that was going to have some longevity?
Well, I feel like, there were people trying to cash in on what they thought of as a fad. So, rapping Rodney, for instance, I talk about it in the book,
Yeah.
Rodney Dangerfield. And
Hilarious.
then, of course, rapper Duke, which, most people know from that line in Big song, Juicy.
Yeah.
And there were other, examples as
Honestly,
well.
you just said that I never even made that connection. So thank you for making that connection for me. I've
Yeah,
never, it's funny. Okay.
that's what most people, they may know that line.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't
Now
know that there was
yeah.
actually a rapping Duke.
Yeah. Rap and Duke.
And I, of course, point out some of the horrible views of John Wayne in the book that further indicate why that
Straight
was
out racist. Yeah. Like as flavor.
Yeah. I mean, Chuck would say that later in Fight the Power.
Yeah.
Um, but when I think about people trying to cash in on what they thought was a trend, I mean, you have a lot of music during that time. Not a lot, but you have music during that time, and people who aren't rappers are trying to rap, so it feels like it could be a fad. But I don't know that I ever thought that was really hip hop as much as it was someone trying to cash in
Yeah.
on what they thought was a popular trend. So, nobody I knew was listening to, rapping Duke saying, "Oh, that's the shit." Like, I don't know anybody who was saying that. It
Right.
was more like something to laugh at.
Yeah. I wonder why they even made that.
I mean, they're trying to cash in. It's like, oh, here's this thing. And I think also, um, I think a lot of people felt like, we were used to singers. Like, I mean, you listen to these incredible singers, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin. I mean, these people really were talented. They're great singers. And so here these guys, they're rapping. A lot of people thought that was just like talking.
Yep.
They didn't think it was, a serious art form because they thought singing was a serious art form or playing a musical instrument. And so I felt like there was a sense that, anybody can do this.
Yeah.
And clearly, not everybody can do it. And rap is an art form. And ultimately, when we get to, say, somebody like Rakim, spitting bars, lyrics becomes like poetry. It's like poetic. And clearly, you can't do that. But I think early on, there was maybe some sentiment that this wasn't that hard to do. And so, hey, like, this is the hot new thing. Let's make a really silly song and cash in on it and, move on. But I don't think of that music as really being at the center of the culture by any means. I just think of it as indicative of, at a particular time, people assuming they could cash in on what they thought was a trend. But as I say, there are no 50-year trends. There are no 50-year fads.
Thing.
So the culture was moving forward, even though there were people trying to sort of make a buck off of it, not fully invested in the culture. And I think it was pretty clear that what they were doing was corny as opposed to innovative.
And the culture in hip hop just seems to move ahead so quickly sometimes. Like literally, like there's a generation of rappers that almost gets like, I'm thinking of rap here and not just all, I have to think of hip hop as everything. But sometimes like I think like even the newest, like you have a Rakim who comes along and something like the old guys like the Sugar Hill Gang and stuff, it just seems so old and dated by the time a Rakim comes along. He's doing something that's so innovative and different that they're just, it's always changing. It's changing very quickly. It seems like hip hop changes very quickly and rapidly.
Well, I mean, if Sugar Hill Gang comes out with Rappers Delight in 1979, people are starting to hear Rakim in maybe 86, 87, somewhere in there. So in the music industry, that's a long time.
That's true. That's true.
Maybe not a long time in sort of general years, but a lot happens. And so once you hear Rakim, it's like, oh, okay, these guys in Sugar Hill Gang were kind of funny, but this is the real deal.
This is the real deal. And what you mentioned this, and I've heard him say this, that I didn't realize he was a saxophone player, because I know that he said that sometimes when he did his rhymes, he was thinking of solos, by his favorite, bebop artists, and it has that rhythm, which is incredible. Rakim is like my favorite rapper of all time, so I have to give shout out. And shout out, there's a word that we all say that came from hip hop, right? And everybody says it.
Everybody says it.
Right.
I mean, I think that point about Rakim is an important one because, Rakim's influenced by people like John Coltrane and, the artistry of a John Coltrane or Wayne Shorter or Dexter Gordon or, any of the great jazz saxophone players, to bring that energy to a, sort of a rap line, a rap bar, to lyrics, right? I mean, to bring that energy, like I'm going to approach my lyrics like John Coltrane approached playing the saxophone. I mean, woo, that's heavy. So it's like, I'm not just standing on the corner talking shit. I'm not just standing on the corner rhyming, as Chuck says, I don't rhyme for the sake of riddling. I'm not just rhyming for the sake of riddling. Like I'm really bringing an artistic approach to what it is I'm doing. And I think that's elevating the culture. So now you can't sit up and say, oh, I can do that. No, you can't do that. This is skill. And Rakim is really important and influential in elevating the game and raising the bar. And so now if you're going to be an MC, it's not just about hyping the crowd. that's the era I grew up in. That's the, generation I grew up in. I mean, when I was emceeing, it was about hyping the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
A few years later, it was about bars. And Rakim, I think, is very important and hugely significant in that development. I call him the poet laureate of hip hop.
Yep.
People, of course, refer to him as the God MC. There's a reason for this,
Yeah.
because his approach to it was artistic and creative in such a way that it elevated the game, and you couldn't do what you were doing before after Rakim had, made his presence felt.
You mentioned Chuck D. I feel like that's the next sort of topic I want to talk about in Public Enemy, and sort of the influence of politics in rap and in the influence of politics, the overall hip hop culture, and how it influenced, the style, the music of the time. You talk about, the Black Power movement, et cetera, Malcolm X. Can you talk about that influence? Because I feel like we go from Rakim to like a different era, which is the Chuck D, Public Enemy, then all the stuff that happens on the West Coast, which seems to have a little bit more politics in it.
Well, in the first chapter of the book in the 70s, I talk about influences from, say, the Black Power movement, particularly the Black Panther Party, and also, someone like Angela Davis. Someone was saying to me, I've never seen a book on hip hop that included Angela Davis. I'm like, but there's a great photograph of Angela Davis in the book, with her afro smoking a cigarette, and
Yeah.
a period of time when photographers were using cigarette smoke to kind of, create a vibe, in their photography. But hip hop has always been political. I mean, it grew out of political circumstances. So in the early 80s, I remember hearing Gil Scott-Heron's song B Movie, and which is, it's just really a thorough critique of, Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics. And I was in high school when I heard this, and I'm like, wow, this is like deep analysis, like the way he broke down who Reagan was and what he represented. But as I say, Gil Scott-Heron was not a rapper, but he was doing this in this kind of spoken word way, and people were playing it on the radio because, rap music was new, and there were connections there. Certainly it influenced what you would later hear with Melly Mel and Duke Booty on The Message, which I think is maybe the most important hip hop song in history, because the message says to us, this is not just about rhyming. It's not just about, partying. This is something we can use to make social critique.
Mm-hmm.
And, later when Chuck and Public Enemy emerge, I mean, Chuck is just educating people, and Public Enemy's, sampling Malcolm X, or they're referencing Malcolm X, or they're referencing the Nation of Islam. They're referencing Huey Newton. They're bringing all these figures from that previous era into the music. Chuck at the time famously made this point about rap music being like, cable news for Black culture.
Right. And of Black culture. Yeah.
So, the opening event for Rappers Deluxe earlier this month, I guess last month now, it's March the 1st. So the early part of February, my opening event for the book was a conversation with Chuck D at the Broad Museum here in Los Angeles. And so it was great to kind of kick the book off, with such a prominent figure like Chuck, and have this really, amazing conversation about all these issues, because what Chuck did with Public Enemy was so influential. And out of this, you get, a certain political strain of hip hop that, has been around for a long time. And you also get the sort of West Coast version of that with NWA, and subsequently, you think about all the lyrics Ice Cube was writing. And then when Ice Cube goes solo, he links up with, the Bomb Squad, Public Enemy, and starts recording what I think are really important,
Yeah.
solo albums where Ice Cube is talking a lot about politics. You also had groups like Brand Nubian, 5% Nation of Islam was very influential, and other rappers, Rakim and Big Daddy Kane. And so you had this kind of influence coming from multiple spaces, but there was a way in which people were consciously using the music to talk about political issues. And, subsequently that kind of gave way to other narratives. But even in a lot of those gangster narratives, it's rooted in a certain political sense. So hip hop has always been political, sometimes perhaps maybe more overt than other times, but the music was, amongst other things, a way for people in marginalized communities to speak truth to power in a creative way. And I think that's why that music was so influential, and why it, kind of set a standard again for the music to be something other than just, rhyming for the sake of rhyming.
Well said. So I want to be mindful of your time, and we will stop our conversation about hip hop in 1991. However, your book, probably the biggest chapter in the entire book is about the 90s, because that is in my, and this is just my opinion, is really the golden era of hip hop. It's like when hip hop really finds its true value, and some of the greatest, art of all time comes out of that era. But I honestly feel like I just talked to you just about the 90s for another 2 hours. So I will stop at the origin story here. I do want to get your take on why you think it's endured for 50 years. What is it about hip hop? Because there's been other movements, right, in Black culture that maybe even like bebop or something. I'm just thinking of other movements. That's a music movement that maybe didn't endure for 50 years. So why do you think this particular movement endured so long?
Well, I mean, if you think about when it started in the 70s, what do we have? We have vinyl records, maybe cassette tapes, 8-track tapes, film, and television.
Mm-hmm.
And you move forward, and eventually you get cable television. You get CDs. Eventually you get DVDs. At some point you get the internet, and at some point you get social media.
Yeah.
The shift from analog to digital. So if you think about that 50-year arc, a lot happened technologically speaking, and hip hop covers all that. So, a lot of it is timing. Bebop was hugely influential, but bebop was never popular music for the masses.
No.
It was, music for the truly initiated, for the hip. It wasn't working at that mass cultural level in the way that hip hop was. So, I just think when you think about it, over a 50-year period, the culture is bigger than the music. And it's able to encompass all of these other things that I talk about in the book, so that it becomes a lifestyle. It becomes a way of life. It becomes a way of looking at the world. It becomes so many things beyond just the music. And really, this is the point of the book, So if you want to talk about, like I do in the 4th chapter, hip hop helping to elect the nation's first Black president, I mean, that's substantial.
Hmm.
And, once Obama's elected, just think about how closely he aligned himself with elements of the hip hop community. I mean, now Obama's become kind of tastemaker in chief.
Yeah.
I mean, he releases his,
Book.
top albums and
Yeah. Book.
movies. a book. I mean, I don't remember a president doing this before Obama.
Also, Obama quotes, the dust off your shoulder. Like he quotes raps and stuff in his speeches.
I mean, yeah, I mean, which I mentioned in the fourth chapter, he's like brushes his shoulder off.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he embraces the culture. And once he got in office, he embraced the people who created the culture. Hip hop had never been in the White House. I talk about a conversation Obama has with Kendrick Lamar. And he talks about the fact that, who would have believed that both of us would be here having this conversation in the White House. So when you think about, politics, I've mentioned language, the way people talk, and I hear people all the time, people who have nothing to do with hip hop, people who are antagonistic towards hip hop, using phrases that come directly out of hip hop, and they don't even know that's what they're doing. When you can, influence the way someone speaks, and they don't even realize it, I mean, that's pretty powerful. There's a story I like to tell. This is not in the book; it's a personal story, but it kind of sheds light on this phenomena as it plays out across the timeline in the book. But I was in Tokyo once, and someone had pointed me in the direction of a hip hop club in Tokyo. This is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe. Let's say late 90s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember they were playing Biggie Smalls. I remember we went to Tennessee. When we came home, Mad Messages was on my phone. Me being the man that I am, took it to the condo pronto, half Indian, called it Tonto. They're like, so I'm like, all right, I'm enjoying that. And I see this woman who's dancing, this Japanese woman who's like just dancing. She's really like, enjoying the music, and she's rapping every line. And it's kind of fascinating.
Right.
I mean, she's really like, she knows every word. And she's dancing and she's rapping, and, and I'm impressed. I'm like, wow, I'm in Tokyo for the first time. And, this is, as I say, late 90s. And I go up to her and I want to compliment her, because I'm like, this is really impressive to someone like me, seeing here I am on the other side of the world, how much, people are responding to my culture, my music, And when I approach her, she smiles and she says, "I'm sorry, but I don't speak English." And I thought, wow, like, she doesn't speak English, but she knows every word to Biggie Smalls. She doesn't speak English, but she speaks Biggie. She doesn't speak English, but she speaks hip hop. That was a really profound moment for me, because it demonstrated how, in spite of a language barrier, I couldn't have a conversation with her in English. I certainly couldn't speak Japanese. I couldn't have a conversation with her in English, but she knew every word to a Biggie Smalls song. And that, to me, just spoke to how influential the culture was, and the fact that her connection to the English language was through hip hop. And when I thought about that, I thought, this is why this culture is so significant, because it's appealing to people in spite of the obvious obstacles that might prevent such a connection. It's global. And so, this is implied in the subtitle of the book, How Hip Hop Made the World. Because in 1973, when Kool Herc is throwing that party, I don't know that they could imagine that it would reach into all these places so many years later. But because of the 50 years, I get the opportunity to chronicle this and to talk about how effective the culture has been in so many places, even in ways that, people probably never anticipated would happen.
That is a great story to end on. Todd Boyd, thank you so much for putting out this book and for doing this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Called Rappers Deluxe, and you can find it anywhere you buy books. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's awesome. All right. Take care.
All right. You too.
Bye.
Bye.